Theologian, author, former US Ambassador Michael Novak was the George Frederick Jewett Chair in Philosophy, Religion, and Public Policy at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and he is currently the Visiting Professor and Trustee at Ave Maria University in Florida. He is the 1994 recipient of the $1 million Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion. Ambassador Novak has written numerous influential books on economics, philosophy, and theology. His masterpiece, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, was published in 1982 and was published underground in Poland in 1984, and afterwards in 1989 in Czechoslovakia, Germany, China, Hungary, Bangladesh, Korea, and many times in Latin America. For his work and influence, he has received many international awards. I want you to join me in welcoming Ambassador Michael Novak. Now, Michael, this evening reminds me of what might be called the proto-Acton Institute dinners that took place in your home in Washington, D.C. in the early 1980s when I was a seminarian at the Catholic University of America. And those evenings were just splendid. The cooking was superb. And I just thought you might give us a picture and a bit of the aroma of what went on those evenings. We had, how many? It was I don't remember how many dinners we had together.
A good many. We had them, Karen and I had them pretty regularly. Karen was fearless about preparing down-home dinners. It wasn't pretentious at all. In fact, Claire Booth-Luce became a very good friend of ours, and when she'd had a particularly bad day, her secretary would call and say, "Could you invite Claire to dinner?" And would start from there. And she was the center of the conversation, at the center of the conversation many times. What she loved about the meals was their unpretentiousness. There weren't any waiters or butlers or anything. My kids helped serve table, and the rest of us pitched in. People at the table pitched in. And she loved that. And she liked it so much that for her own last dinner, the last meal she had with her family, and I think outsiders were only Karen and me and my daughter Tanya, who reminded her of her daughter Anne, who was killed in an automobile accident at Stanford. And our Tanya was at Stanford. In fact, she was baptized in the chapel that Claire built for the Newman Center there, St. Anne. So it was really good fun. And I loved having you there, Father, because 2 or 3 reasons. So everybody could meet a devout seminarian and a good priest and a wise conversationalist at these meals. It's very important at a dinner for some Charles Krauthammer and famous
Jack Kemp,
Henry Hyde. They were just
Charles
famous writers and men of and women of pride and distinction. And when you have jewels like that, they reflect best on a dark velvet background of honor and respect. And you need to give them that to help them to shine. And you did that. But most of all, Father, we'd like to invite you, because nobody in Washington made a better antipasto than you did. It took you most of the afternoon and most of our kitchen, but they were magnificent. And so I'm glad you were there many times.
I have a letter in my office from Claire Booth-Luce asking for the recipe.
Yeah, I believe it.
Tell us, what we're going to do is kind of attempt tonight to cover your life and your work, and then give our audience here at the 2012 Acton University an opportunity to ask you some questions.
Great.
Tell us a little about your upbringing in Pennsylvania, the nature of your home, a bit about your parents and your brothers.
Well, we were a very poor immigrant family. My parents were, it was my grandparents who came, and my parents decided not to teach us Slovak. They were from Slovakia in the center of Europe, really the very center, very heart of Europe. And they wanted us to learn English and in a way jump a generation over our peers, and I think we did. But I've always regretted not knowing Slovak and the other languages of Middle Europe. Hungarian would have been next door, and Poland, if you understand Slovak. The Slavic languages were first put in dictionary form in the New Testament in Slovakia. So at the root of Russian and all the other languages, there's a Slovak a simple beginning. Sorry I didn't have all that, but it was great to be brought up in poverty. It was just great. I mean, not only, and in the Depression, not only did you learn to pinch pennies, but you learned to live on very little, which is a great asset in a marriage, especially if you're married to what my father-in-law used to call my son-in-law, the celestial philosopher, who was...
we'll get to that.
Yeah, but anyway, and my grandfather, just say one last word. My grandfather, I remember, he barely spoke English, common laborer, then he worked in the butcher market, they called it, that he and his wife put together, general store. And I used to remember him sitting in the corner of the kitchen in his home after the meals. It was a kitchen dining room. He would go over to a corner beneath a picture of Our Lady in the Mother of Sorrows, or Jesus in the Garden, I don't remember for sure. And he would get out his little wicker basket with his prayer book in Slovak and his rosary. And he'd just pray there for 20 minutes or half an hour. And of course I couldn't understand it. It was in Slovak, but still I knew what he was doing. And in any case, that did rub off on me. I very early learned that I wanted to become a priest. I wanted to give my life to God, put it simply. I loved serving Mass early in the morning. I loved getting there before anybody was there. And so then I wanted to go to the seminary after 8th grade because I loved girls. I was very good in football. I have very big hands. I was very fast. It's hard to believe, I know. But I was a very good pass catcher.
Your brother was already
No. I was the oldest,
you were
and
the
I went
oldest.
first.
Okay.
And then my parents then didn't want me to go. My pastor didn't want me to go. The nuns didn't want me to go. Everybody tried to stop me from going after 8th grade. They wanted me to go through high school. And I felt high school would be disastrous for me, between girls and football. And my father said the worst way to deal with Michael is to say no. You know, he has incredible willpower, but not much won't power. And if you try to stop him, he'll just push right through. Anyway, so I went. My father expected me to come home after 1 year, then after the 2nd year, then after the 3rd year. And after the 11th year and going into my final year, they were convinced I was going to be ordained. And meanwhile, I was having 2 or 3 years of very great doubts, not about wanting to serve God, but about where and how. And I just thought the priesthood is not right for me.
So
I left.
this at the end of those studies, in the theological part of the studies,
Yeah.
these were in Rome.
I did 2 years in Rome, got my bachelor equivalent to a master's degree there.
Right.
And then I came back wanted to leave, and my superior said, you come back, make up your mind in America, leave if you want to, but make up your mind on your home soil with your family and everything, not overseas. And I didn't want to do that, but I did it, and I was later very glad I did. But anyway, I left, and I just didn't think I would make it as a priest, and if I failed, I would be so miserable, it would be unlivable.
Now let's clear up one myth, one urban legend about you.
Yeah.
You wrote a book entitled "The Tiber Was Silver." In 1961, it was published, in which you describe a young seminarian falling in love with an artist in Rome and marrying her. Now,
No, not marrying her.
oh,
He went on to be ordained.
Oh, he went on to be ordained. Okay, but you fell in love with an artist and married her,
Well,
and people think that's
Karen.
Karen in the book.
Well, I didn't meet Karen for almost 2 years. 2 years and almost 3
After
after
that
I left
book.
the seminary.
Okay.
And after the book was published. In fact, on my first date, I gave her the book to read,
Okay.
which she thought was immensely pretentious. And, anyway, we had a blind date, and I don't want to go on this, but I took one look into her eyes, and this is it. And I just, it's the woman I want to marry. Out of prudence, I waited another 9 minutes before I decided. But it took her a year to make up her mind, and she described it to her mother as I finally ran out of reasons for saying no, which a warmer endorsement and a more enthusiastic endorsement I've never seen. But yes, I mean, the description, if you go back and read it, the description in chapter 15 of this young woman, Mary, is uncannily like Karen. Just uncannily.
That's amazing.
And anyway, that's what happened.
So in the 60s, you became a correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter.
I wrote anywhere I could because I didn't have any money.
Right.
And, I'd get $30.
You heard that laughter in the audience, right?
Oh, believe me, you don't know. But you'd get $30 for an article in those days, $15 for a book review. $30 would carry me for a week at Harvard. So.
But in the course of writing in the 60s, you were a kind of correspondent for the Second Vatican Council. You were at, well, not at the council, but you were in Rome during some of the sessions?
Karen and I were married in '63 in June, and she loved Rome. She'd visited. She was an artist. She couldn't imagine a better place to be. And I thought, a council of the church happens only once every 100 years. How can you not be there? So we put our wedding purse, which was not much, and took a ship and went to Rome for the second session, writing articles, as everywhere I could do it, Europe, wherever they would get published. We managed to eke it through week by week. And then in November, I got a contract for a book, completely unexpected. The author who had the contract couldn't finish it, turned it over to me. Catch, I had to have the manuscript in by January 18th. That session of the council ended December 8th or 5th, something like that. So it's a big book.
This is the Open Church.
Yeah, the Open
Okay.
Church.
We'll talk a little bit about that, but let's make sure that everybody understands you were a bit on the left in those days, weren't you?
Oh, I was very on the left. Not so much politically and economically, although if you have a liberal arts education, you drift that way. I mean, what are you free from if you practice the liberal arts? In a single word, work. Messy, vulgar work. And so a liberal arts education tends to make you anti-capitalist, vulgar, crass, Philistine. But theologically, I was a great champion of the council and opening of the church, as the title suggests. But I was always aware from the first of the gestures of the fountains in Rome. On every corner, there are these fountains with these old, what do you call them, gargoyles. And out of their mouths spews the water. And they all have an ironic, distant, almost tragic view, gazing at generation after generation, all filled with dreams and desires, and all ending in vanity and passing. So I was haunted by that. If you go back and read the book, you'll see that motif from first page to last. And I began with the epigram at the beginning: all things good given enough time go badly. And so I was a great enthusiast of the council. I helped as much as anybody to spread the idea of the spirit of Vatican II, because I was doing the main reporting in Catholic circles on the council as a witness there. And
but there were dinner parties and meetings in Rome in those days with a lot of people who were doing similar kinds of reporting to your own, no?
Oh yeah, but also
Robert McAfee Brown and
he was there as a Protestant observer with a
Right.
great deal more dignity than a mere Catholic had in those days at the council, at Catholic Laban. And it was great to watch the bishops come up in school buses. I mean, you never saw anything so funny as 38 princes of the church getting out of a school orange school bus, one after the other. It was just an unbelievably romantic and great time.
Yeah.
It was just wonderful. But yeah, dinners, not so much the first year when I was on my own purse, but the second year, Time magazine asked me to go back. And they couldn't spend enough money. I mean, they couldn't take any money out of Rome by the treaty. They had to spend everything they earned in Italy. So they kept pressing money on me, and I wasn't taking enough, and I got reprimanded. And the point, you're supposed to go to dinners and lunches. So, you know, I would get Ronner and Kung and young Ratzinger and...
Dulles in those days? Did you know Avery
No,
Dulles
I didn't
then?
know Avery. I knew Bernardine. Bernardine was a young priest, secretary.
This would be the later Cardinal
Bernardine in
Chicago.
Chicago. And we knew practically everybody. And I never met Wojtyła there. I knew Wojtyła was important. And I really regret...
You knew he was important then?
Oh,
even.
yeah. Because he was on the Council of Five or something who planned out the church in the world and led that discussion. And at the end, at the beginning, all the bishops were asked for advice, and he said the council, he was a young man, the youngest then, and he had his comment was that the council should be founded around two notions: the person, the difference between a person, a cat, and a son or daughter. They're totally different. And what is it that makes the difference? So he'd written his own book. He was writing his own book on the person. So the person and the community. What is the community? How does the community nourish the person, and the person the community, as the two key notions? And that's what happened. And at the end, he's the one who insisted on the Declaration of Religious Liberty. When the bishops were undecided and the Pope was hesitating, he said, we can't go back to Eastern Europe without that. We must have that. So it went through.
But if I have my chronology correct, about this time, or maybe when you came back to the United States, the Apostolic Nuncio in the United States called for your silencing.
I don't know that, Father.
Oh.
I don't know that.
My research tells me that.
Well, you know...
Have you ever heard that before? Is this a surprise to you?
It's not a surprise because I got an inkling of it before when you were telling me questions you might want to ask. And I asked for that. I mean, I don't go do an interview without I'd ask for a little bit of help for it.
Of
Someone,
course.
you know, you don't want to be two ships passing in the night. You want to get it done. And I didn't know that. And I do know I was banned in certain dioceses. I've been banned on the right and I've been banned on the left. I've had experiences on both sides.
Well, you're most known today, I think it's fair to say, in terms of your economic thought. But theology has always been one of your real loves, and philosophy. And this has had a major interest in your work. Who were your favorite theologians? Whose influence can one see in your work?
Well, people I like most, I try to build my life around, are Jacques Maritain, and a philosopher who had great interest in theological questions, questions which in a way are posed by theology for a philosopher, like the notion of the person. The person is an idea that arose from the discussions of the Trinity. How can Jesus be both God and man? Well, is God as a person, human being as a person, united in personhood? Well, what's a person? And that's a problem for philosophy, and it's a central problem. And emerged clearest in the 20th century of all things. But anyway, so Maritain, then Bernard Lonergan, whom I had in Rome, a Jesuit, not so famous, but just brilliant. I'm not alone in thinking he's the best mind in the Catholic Church since Thomas Aquinas. And even considering Cardinal Newman, I think he's got a better and a deeper mind, a clearer mind. And he has the advantage of doing his thinking and writing in English, which is a very rich language, concrete language. And it has a natural Aristotelian bent to it. If you think of Aristotle as always pointing to the earth and Plato as always pointing to heaven, English is a down-to-earth language. And then Reinhold Niebuhr, the great evangelical mainland Protestant theologian. I loved his work. He gave me a great deal of encouragement when I was young. To be completely modest, he thought I was his best or among his best interpreters in the United States, young as I was. And my idea of story and narrative and so on come from him. And especially the notion of sin. He was so good on understanding the sinfulness of human beings and the limitations and even a notion that St. Augustine had, that even when you are forgiven your sins, it's like having thrown your knee out. And even when it's healed, you have to be real careful you don't throw it out again. It's always got a weakness in it. And of course, that's what the American idea is founded on, isn't it? The fact that every human being is sometimes a sinner. And therefore, you have to place your trust not in human beings, but in God. In God we trust, nobody else, as the saying goes.
There was a turn in your theology, roughly in, the late 70s, the early 80s. You went from being the author of Theology for Radical Politics to the author of The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, and took a lot of criticism.
Well, after the Vatican Council, I thought there are so many great theologians working on theology. I better learn a little bit more about politics and economics if I want to be like Niebuhr and Maritain, for that matter. And so I spent as much of my energy doing that as I could, continuing my studies in theology. And so I determined not to specialize in the theological, prepare myself more for teaching in a secular university and in secular environments. And I went to Stanford, hired me right out of graduate school. I didn't even have my doctorate then, and I never did get it. But I went to Stanford as an associate professor, and due to Robert McAfee Brown, you mentioned, from Stanford, and started learning more about politics. I wanted to learn economics, but I learned quickly that's very difficult. You have to learn a lot of things. And economics is sort of backwards. It's counterintuitive. So I worked in politics first. And I loved the student rebellion, at least at Stanford, not Berkeley, but at Stanford in 1965 when I went there, 66, 67, left in 68, because it was so rooted in conscience and integrity and authenticity. And these were notions I was trying to communicate through Albert Camus, my other favorite writer of that time, because he did both philosophy and fiction. And I wanted to be a novelist more than anything. I just didn't have the talent. So I was always critical of the kind of liberal politics represented at Harvard. Value-free, supremely pragmatic, no big questions. That's metaphysics. And the rest, I didn't like that sort of liberalism. And so I became a critic of that. I did an article for Harper's Magazine in my first year in graduate school called God in the Colleges, in which I attacked that very severely. And that article became one of the founding articles of the New Left. Tom Hayden and others circulated it. It was a critique of liberalism from the left, but from a philosophical.
Would you say that it was a critique from the left, of the left?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
so
Bobby,
this is more radical.
Yes, yes, it was. That's how I, began to think of myself as more radical, because the liberals didn't like me. I mean, I didn't like the liberals, so it was reciprocal.
Still don't.
I wrote a piece about this. What was it called? The Secular Saint. A long piece in a Methodist magazine called Motive, a great magazine out of Nashville in its time, and it was put in the hands of Robert Kennedy by the editor of the Nashville Tennessean, and Bobby Kennedy came to see me in California, the first person he saw in California when he was decided to campaign. He said he decided to campaign after reading that article. Now, he may have told that to 100 people. You know, I'm not going to judge politicians very harshly, but
Oh, please do.
but no, I like the guys. There's only one I don't like. That was John Anderson, not to make you wait too long. He was so pretentious. When he gave his renunciation speech, dropped himself out of the race. Before he was introduced, I said to Karen, we were watching it at night, and I said to Karen, I know half of what he's going to say. She looked at me in a way a wife does. And I said, I. And it's true, that's what happened.
You were a speechwriter for McGovern?
Well, I'm like a Budweiser horse, and every 4 years, my paws start beating on the earth, you know, and I'm ready to go. Yeah, I just love primary campaigns. I've taken part in every one since '68. And I might have missed one or two.
Are you still a Democrat?
I just stopped being a Democrat 2 years ago. I had to register in Delaware because I sold my house in Washington after Karen's death. And I needed to get my driver's license, and you have to register in order to get your driver's license. And I said, put me down as independent. And she was going to do that. And I said, wait a minute, does that mean I can still vote in the primaries? She said, no. I said, put me down as Republican. And it was the abortion issue more than anything else. I just wasn't going to give my economic issues more and more too. But the bottom line was
So let's circle back to the study of politics and economics. And this kind of precipitates a change in your thinking and has an impact on your theological dispositions.
Well, yes, although my theology's been fairly consistent. I mean, there's some changes, but I had such a good foundation in Lonergan, and Durwell, his book on the resurrection, and so many other great books that I read, Mark Guardini, and de Lubac, most of all. And so I had a good, deep foundation, which just withstood all kinds of shocks and hits. But I became more critical of the left, and then I was hired at Old Westbury, an experimental college, where the most left-wing student we had was almost isolated because he was supporting Gene McCarthy. Nobody else, everybody thought elections are bourgeois illusion. It was just a crazy place. But they all cited authors from the far left. Everything they did was justified by an author that I had read and admired. And I realized, boy, there's something crazy here. And I started criticizing that part of the left, and I began losing more and more of my friends. And so I became a critic of the left, from the left.
So it wasn't a
and
road
a critic
to
of
Damascus.
the left, too.
Yeah, it wasn't road to Damascus.
No, I wish it were a road to
gradual.
Damascus. It'd be easy to describe, but
Yeah.
no, it was 1,000 little cuts. I was for the war on poverty, and then already 2 years later, violent crime among young adults was way up. Kennedy started a commission to study juvenile delinquency and passed a big bill to help reduce. Quaint term. Where's the last time you heard that? Now it's called violent youth crime. And I thought, boy, this war on poverty isn't doing what it was supposed to do.
Talk to us about liberation theology.
Well,
Okay,
the underlying, that's good, but
Yeah.
the underlying part of this is I taught courses in Cuernavaca. What was the name of the priest who had that institute? Study of languages, but Peter Berger and I think Richard Newhouse lectured there, and I was lecturing on the coming revolution, you know. But I didn't say much about economics because I didn't know enough. And Peter Berger had just completed a study of the quote, Four Little Tigers of Asia, and he wrote
Ugo
a,
Osman? Osman?
oh no, I did meet him, but
No, I thought that's who you were talking about.
no, he was a great Dominican macher and shaker from,
Not Frabeto. Frabeto?
no,
Frabeto.
no,
Okay,
I'm
anyway,
sorry,
yeah, no, that's okay.
senior moment, but
Two senior moments.
anyway, Berger had written a book, Pyramids of Sacrifice, which was like a plague on both your houses. Socialism is cruel and terrible, but so is capitalism. And then he studied the Four Little Tigers of Asia and saw that they had doubled their income, and then since 1945, 1950, doubled their income again, and doubled their income again, and doubled it again. And they were now living at about the level of Southern Europe. And so it suddenly hit him that capitalism can actually lift the poor. And he had to put that in, and then he made us, anyway, he had a big influence on me on being more kind to capitalism, less, but why? How? How could I understand self-interest? Selfishness? How could I understand markets? How can, I had the mental image that to have order, there needs to be command. And it took me a while to realize there are all kinds of order, like a path up a mountain in the Alps. Every mountain you hike, you find paths already there, cut by scores of thousands of hikers in the past based on experience. A slow path for saving your energy and enjoying the views, and a more arduous, quick path if you're young and want to get there up there fast, you know. And nobody planned those, nobody ordered those, but practical people trying to be efficient find the best way to do it, the best order to do it. So there is a kind of order that comes out of practical activities.
So get into liberation theology, because we
Liberation theology is
met
next.
having to do a lot with that when I suggested. I think you had written an article in the New York Times Magazine, would it have been, on liberation theology?
No, it was a chapter of the Open Church, Why is Latin America Poor? And The Atlantic published it. And it was one of the, Atlantic is over 100 years old, and it was one of the two articles in their entire history that drew the most mail. Every professor of Latin American studies in the United States and some from outside wrote their own opinion. They were about half and half, damning the article and praising it.
So I saw that and I said, why not a book? Because at that time, I think there was only one book that dealt with liberation theology. I think Father Schall at Georgetown had a series of essays, but I didn't remember any critique. And there was a veritable library of books in favor
Once
of...
the Spirit of Democratic Capitalism came out, I started having invitations from all over Latin America. I went to Latin America so often. I went to Chile so often that the Secretary of State told me that if I came back one more time, they'd make me a citizen. And the head of the Socialist Party, who later became the president of Chile, asked if he could publish the Spirit of Democratic Capitalism under the socialist imprint, just to show people that socialism is not based on the bad economics of the 19th century. Marx and Lenin were completely wrong about that. Socialism is essentially a cultural movement trying to change the culture, non-Christian, non-Jewish, secular, sexual liberation, etc. That's what socialism is. So I went so often, and then I was becoming aware of liberation theology. And so I wrote a book, Will It Liberate? Just asking the practical question, does it work? Show me after these thousands of pages of liberation theology, and I read them until my eyeballs were hanging out. Boring, boring, boring. And not a word about how you'd actually help the poor.
Right.
So I was saying, show me how it helps the poor. And nobody could answer. Gutierrez, one of the founders of it from Peru, told me shamefacedly that, look, he was a theologian, not an economist, and he went to the universities, the sociology and economics, and that's what they told him. So he said he's not committed to the Marxism. That's what he was told was the big thing. And anyway, It disappeared as soon as Latin America turned democratic in the Reagan years, nation by nation by nation. Liberation theology, supposedly people's religion, could not mount a political party, could not run a successful candidate. It was a mirage. And so it pretty much disappeared, except as a spiritual force.
One influence of liberation theology in the United States, some would contend, I would contend, was seen in the 1986 Bishop's Pastoral Economic Justice for All. Now, you were very involved in orchestrating you didn't call it a response piece, but it was a lay letter.
It started in 1984.
Right.
When Claire Booth Lewis, no, in 1981, when Reagan was in, and a bishop's going to do a letter on nuclear arms. I think it started in '83, yes. And Claire Booth Lewis called me, and there was an American
Bill
general.
Simon.
Well, no, Simon wasn't intimately involved in the first one. He was involved, but not intimately. It was more military people and people in foreign policy. Catholic, and we got 100 anyway. Mm-hmm. Dick Allen and a whole bunch of others. Trying to think, there was a Polish Catholic 4-star general, Vernon Williams, what was his name, who, the CIA man for a long time.
Vernon
Williams, is that right?
Vernon.
Not George.
Jordan, no?
No, that's the basketball player. Vernon. But anyway, there has to be something done. So I put together a team of people. We had regular meetings, and we wrote. We're the first lay people in history to issue a pastoral letter.
Right.
And after all the left magazines saying we need the voice of the layman, and when we suddenly appeared, they hated it.
Yes,
and
Archbishop Winkland was none too impressed with it, as I recall, when you and Bill Simon went to see him, no?
But no, that was the economic letter.
Oh, I'm sorry.
2 years later.
Yeah.
But
it was
the Vatican, the minute the nuncio saw this, I took it to him to show it, because we're going to come out, and we don't mean it to be critical of the bishops. We don't know what the bishops are going to say, but we think this is a lay issue. And he read it. He called me back that afternoon and said, I'm putting it in the Vatican tonight. They're having a big meeting with the European theologians Friday, and it'll be very important to them. So they distributed it, and the Germans and French followed that model, not the American bishop's model. So it had its, anyway. So Bill Simon called me 2 or 3 years later when they were going to do a pastoral letter on the economy, and he said, hey, look, this is a layperson's job. This is not a bishop's job to write about economic. How can you live in the country which has brought up more poor people into being middle class and wealthy than any in history, and not see it's an immense success for the poor? And how can the Catholic bishops of the United States not see that? I mean, if they addressed a pastoral letter to the Catholic population in 1936, 1934, they have addressed a population overwhelmingly poor. Mm-hmm. They were writing in 1984, and they're overwhelmingly middle class and successful and some wealthy, and they didn't see that. So we wrote a letter, and I asked Archbishop Winkland. He was a good friend of mine. He was born about 15 miles away from where I was born. And I asked him, I said, look, we're not writing this in opposition to you. We don't even know what you're saying. I want to send you a copy of what we're doing in advance so you're not surprised. And I said, I would like your advice on when to release it. I would like to release it before the bishop's letter, so it's clearly not a criticism, it's just a lay reflection. If we release it after you have your meeting and you vote in your paper, it will look like criticism, and I don't want to be in that position. I said, well, you choose. And he thought about it, and he realized if we publish it first, it'll be right in time of the election. We'll be blown out of the water by the election news. Mm-hmm. But we figured an angle. We published it on election day, and the day after the election, there's really not a lot to do, and even on election day. So we had a lot of coverage while people are waiting for the returns, and then the papers are deluged with their returns.
We've been selling copies of that for years.
Well,
There may be still some of
it's
them.
all over the world. I mean,
Yeah,
lots of bishops in different countries wrote it, but anyway.
We have to kind of wrap this part of it up and then open it up. You were one of the first to write about business as a vocation. In fact, you have a book by that name. For many people, that's a radical idea. Why don't you say a little bit more about business as a calling from God?
Karen said to me many times that, and what Sam said about a woman who must be obeyed, Chesterton said a married couple is essentially a four-legged animal with one will, hers. And the sooner you recognize it, the happier it is. I mean, it's just a lot better. As a Spanish Latin American friend of mine said, in principle, the husband must have the last word in every argument. But in prudence, it better be, yes, dear. So she said to me, Michael, you write a simpler book, a more direct book than Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, which I felt I had to build like a battleship because I knew everybody would attack it. Mm-hmm. My own publisher wouldn't publish it. Couldn't stand a book on capitalism in the title. Mm-hmm. But some of my friends they backed off from being friends until they saw the reception. So I knew it was going to be attacked, and I tried to make it as formidable as I could make it. But Karen said, write a simpler, more direct book. And so I thought of all these business students I met who were a little bit ashamed about being business students at Notre Dame and other places. And funny story on that, it would put the picture exactly right. I got a call from a professor at Notre Dame in the theology department. He was trying to put together a program he was partly at the business school, on business and theology. And the theology department would not cooperate unless they addressed the question, can a Christian work for a corporation? And he said, look, we've had the theology department, we've had the business school for decades, and they've never had a meeting. He said, this is scandalous. And he said, I've been negotiating for months, but they won't do it unless we do that. I said, I won't speak on that. He said, you have to. And it's the only way we'll do it. I said, okay, I'll do it. So I went to my friend Irving Crystal at AEI, and I said, Irving, I'm supposed to speak on can a Christian work for a corporation? What can I do? And Irving just looked at me slyly in his way and said, just tell them, no. Only Muslims and Jews. And so I did, and they were speechless. They didn't know what. They wanted me to say yes and feel guilty. And I said, well, can a Catholic priest teach physics? It's that kind of question. Anyway, so I thought business students need a way of understanding what they're doing. It's a noble piece of work. You want to set an ideal so that people have to live up to it. And it's there. You can't have a business unless you have three fundamental virtues. You have to have a strong person with initiative and daring. Behind it is a saying, behind every successful, well, let me put it in chauvinist terms. Behind every successful husband, there's a lovely little woman telling him he's wrong. And friends telling him he's going to lose his shirt. There are times when if you're going to do something, you have to do it against all advice. And the businessmen know that, so that's why they talk about the individual so much. There are many, many times when they had to stand alone against everybody. On the other hand, you can't build a business unless you build a community around it. First thing you have to do is hire a lawyer, but you got to get good workers, you got to provide for their pension plans, you got to build customers and good relations, you got to build suppliers, and you network, and person, community, and then practical wisdom. And these are all practical wisdom. There's a US battle cruiser in high waves and bad weather. There's a ship coming directly at it, a light coming directly at them. They flag and send everything to send signals to move to starboard or port. It doesn't move. And so the admiral's called out of his bed and come up to the deck and take charge. And he says, signal them that this is Admiral Jones and this is the U.S. cruiser da-da-da-da. And he said, so move to starboard. And the message comes back, this is Seaman Second Class Smith. I'm on a lighthouse. He said, move to port, hit hard to port quickly. And I mean, this is not a matter of disputation now. Right, this is just practical wisdom.
Sure.
So anyway.
Let's get some people into this discussion. Let me, while you're preparing and indicating that you want to ask a question, there are microphones being circulated. There are a lot of young people here, and we went through names without identifying them. I just suggest that one of the reasons for having this discussion with Ambassador Novak tonight was to really give you a glimpse into the history of this last century, and particularly with regard to theological, philosophical, and economic thinking, and the relationship of these, and just the names that you mentioned, the people you knew, the writings and stuff. Just Google a number of those names if you don't know some of those names, and you'll be impressed later on with the fact that we have Michael Novak with us tonight. So you're going to have to tell me if there's somebody who has a question, because I can't see a thing from here. Yes, I think over there.
Yes, I'm a biblioholic, actually, not a bibliophile. And you mentioned a professor that you had in Rome that you thought was on a par with Niebuhr and Aquinas, but I didn't catch the name, and I was desperately looking through the material trying to find a bibliography. Could you mention his name in a book that you might recommend to us?
Bernard Lonergan, Lonergan, S.J. He wrote
He's a Canadian, wasn't he?
Canadian. Yeah. And he wrote a book called Insight, A Study of Human Understanding. And his basic theme is that the two most common distinctive acts that make us human and that constitute what we mean by human spirit are the act of insight. You open your refrigerator door, you're trying to figure out what you want to make for lunch or dinner, you're living alone, let's say, and you look over what's there, and you start thinking of what your stomach desires and what you feel like, and suddenly it hits you. This is what I'll do. That's an insight. Or you come up, people are laughing at a joke, you didn't hear the punchline, you don't know what they're laughing about, and you're the only one not laughing, you nudge your friend, and and he gives you the punchline, then you break out laughing after everybody else. It's an insight. So it's the most common action, human action. And animals don't have it. And bright people have it more frequently than people who aren't so bright. But a lot of insights are wrong, and that's why bright people make so many mistakes. And in general,
and some big ones.
Yeah, in politics and economics, they're almost always wrong. The universities almost always have things wrong.
Who was it who said that there's nothing so disturbing to a grand, elaborate theory than an ugly little fact?
Yeah. Something, yeah. But anyway, and then judgment. Granted that you have a lot of bright ideas, but most of them don't work out. Well, it's a matter of good judgment to be able to discern which ones are real, which ones are true, which ones are good. Granted, that's provisional, but you're ready to die for that. You have the evidence for that, and you'll hold what you can hold, and then move. And decisions to love, to commit yourself, can be a long struggle, as it was between Karen and me about, we didn't have any doubt about loving each other from the first time, but whether to marry or not. And that's a commitment. And don't tell me it's just a blow that hits you. You do a lot of solid thinking about it. And it's not theoretical thinking, it's very practical, but it matters very much what you do. So don't tell me it isn't a use of judgment. there it is. So I think those are one, and if you play that through epistemology and metaphysics, it's amazing the problems that Lonergan leads us. Also, his book on the Trinity. I had to read it in Latin because I was in Rome, and also his book on the Incarnation. They are translated into English, and the Canadian Jesuits have put all his books into English in Toronto, at the Regis House, I think it is, in Toronto. But they're just the most brilliant discussions of the nature of God, of the Christian God, that one can encounter. And they resolve a number of issues. Anyway, sorry.
There's another question over here? Yes.
Professor, I really enjoyed your talk, and I so much found myself to be so much pleased and opportune to be here this evening to listen to you. I just want to take you out a little bit, not in the ambient which you spoke this evening, but on the side, on the work you have already written on business as a vocation. In the world today, we see the countries and also the continents being loomed in crisis, economic crisis. We have heard of so many countries looking out for loans to be taken out of debts. We have of Greece, we have taken out of that of Spain and Italy, and we don't know the next country that may be the victim. Since business is a vocation and you have taken your time to make a good research on it, how can we be able to give a preemptive advice on the leaders of the world on how to overcome the crisis that is really destroying our nation, our continent, our world today? Thank you.
Well, yes, so if you could just solve the problem of the whole world. And you have about 2 minutes to do it.
After getting over the rush of power coming to my fingertips, I want to make 2 comments. First of all, it's important to understand the nature of capitalism and the nature of business. So, the Socialist Dictionary, in fact, all the American dictionaries, define capitalism as free markets, private property, and
Rule of law,
no,
enterprise,
no,
competition.
no, don't. Looking at it from a anyway, it really, but that fits every economy since Jerusalem in the Bible. Thou shalt not steal, so it has private property. It was nothing but a marketplace, exchange. There was no industries, there was no primary goods there. Markets don't make capitalism. What makes capitalism is invention, innovation, ideas. Lincoln's the greatest teacher of it. If you read the Economics of Abraham Lincoln, I don't have time to do that now, but that's why the land-grant colleges. If you can invent a seed that produces a yield of 3 or 4 more grains than the other seeds, you're a great benefactor of the human race. And it's out of knowledge that wealth proceeds. So capitalism is invention, it's enterprise, it's discovery. Practically every corporation in the United States, every business and around the world is built on an idea, a new good, a new service, a new way of doing them. So creativity, we are made in the image of God to be creators. That's the basic idea. Now, there's a second idea competing in the world, which is equality, not liberty, but equality. And equality administered by the state, since private citizens are not to be trusted. You turn it over to the state. And the state has the purpose of doing good. It can never do enough good. The needs of people are infinite. And to the extent that the state starts to supplying them, they become less and less independent, more and more dependent. They demand more, always more. There's no country can sustain that. And to the extent we have fallen the lure of the welfare states, you need a welfare state up to a limit, but you have a very, very stout limit, because otherwise you create a nation of dependents, of serfs. You build a great government plantation, and you develop a new kind of human person. Gimme, gimme, gimme. dependent. And I predicted maybe 20 years ago that Europe was the welfare state was going to start falling apart. There's no way you can sustain a system in which more and more people live beyond 65, healthcare becomes more and more expensive, and the number of workers providing for their old age assistance is not 7, which is what it was at the time of Bismarck, but 2. There's no way it's self-sustaining. People are going to start to call in all the promises made to them, and the states aren't going to be able to supply them. That's what's happening. Greece, Spain, Italy, France is behind it. Great Britain and Germany are staving it off some. And the United States is in it. We've got to cope with it. So the humanitarian instinct to do good is beautiful, but it can be self-destructive very easily. So you have to leave more room. You have to understand that you can only do this if you create wealth. And you have to have more room. You have to understand the conditions under which wealth is created and favor those conditions. And then you can have prosperity and a boom, and out of that abundance, do an even better, more intelligent set of welfare programs. So, I think that's the crisis. It's not a crisis of capitalism. It's a crisis of the welfare state. And capitalism only insofar as we give into this.
We'll take one more question from the audience.
Ray Flores, Chicago, with American Life League and Better Catholic Giving. Ambassador, just a quick question. You mentioned your time in Rome during the Vatican II Council. Can you share somewhat? I mean, the biggest shock, I think, was going from the Latin Mass to the Mass being in vernacular across the world. What are your thoughts on that and how it's created, I guess, divisions in today's Catholic world?
Well, first of all, I was entirely in favor of that change, and it seemed to me just transparently self-evident why that should be so. In the period before Vatican II, I used to watch the faces in Catholic Church with me when Mass was being recited in Latin, and if they didn't know Latin at all, they couldn't have been more bored. And they were praying their rosary and other things. Those who understood the Latin understood that there's just a beauty to the liturgical Latin, a succinctness and a wit and an elevation and a way of thinking that's not like the Lions Club or the Rotary Club. It's a different mental world. And entering into that different mental world is very important to worship. But I never imagined at Vatican II, nor did Vatican II ever imagine, that Latin would perish. It was always supposed to be Latin masses. But English masses normally, ordinarily, but not every Sunday, every Mass.
Or Latin and English. The canon in Latin and
Well,
prophets in English.
yeah, although, okay. I mean, I'm willing to, I'm not a purist in that, though I know people who are. But I do love the restoration of the Latin, which we're undergoing now. That is the possibility of the Latin. It's great to go wherever you go in the world, it really is, and celebrate a Mass in Latin with fellow Catholics in one language. It's like Hebrew. It's a very important bond. And I want to repeat, the mental discipline involved in Latin is extraordinary. And the beauty, the liturgical beauty. That you can do puns in Latin just by the change of a letter or two on the ending. That Augustine was so brilliant, and so many Aquinas' hymns are just untranslatable. They're so clever and so exact. So people who don't know the Latin are really missing the beauty of what our ancestors have created over centuries.
I want to take a point of special privilege just to ask you a final question, and just tell us some of your memories of Blessed John Paul II.
Well, I had the privilege of going to Mass with him in his private chapel maybe 5 times, and you never saw anybody pray as he prayed. I mean, he'd be hunched over before Mass and all through Mass, and he was in a world of his own. He was there with us, but he wasn't there with us. This is something people have commonly expressed on having been with him. that he goes into a kind of mystical, he can't use the language very well, a trance of being in the presence of God, and the presence of God absorbs him. So that's, I think, the most important thing. Second, I also had the privilege of having lunch or dinner with him a dozen times. In fact, this is impossible to believe, and don't believe it if you don't want to, but his secretary instructed me, anytime I'm coming to Rome, write ahead or just call when I'm there, and if the Pope is free, he'll see me. I knew the price of that was I had to come prepared with a joke, because he loves jokes. And so I would, and most of the time I was invited. Not alone, but with others. Or if my friends were invited, George Weigel or Father Ziemba, my Polish colleague, who the Pope liked like a son, loved like a son. If they were invited, they'd invite me, like that. And the most amazing thing, how down to earth, eating with the Pope was like eating with your uncle or your grandfather. And I'm Central European, the same kind of food. And it was just very plain. We'd have the mandatory pasta because we were in Italy. But everything else would be overcooked veal or pork or red cabbage or, Central European dishes, a little lemon cake at the end. That was his favorite dessert. There's a Polish name for it, which I don't remember. And his eyes twinkled like St. Nick's, the bright blue. He loved jokes. He was very direct in his questioning. He said to me once, he said, I just came back from a trip to Brazil, Colombia. It was incredible misery. He said, what can we do? What should we do for the poor in the third world? Same question you pulled a few minutes ago. And I said, I know this seems silly, Father, but you've got to do three things. I said, in Brazil, the average age of education, the years in education, is 3 years of education. I said, that's a sin. The most important resource in every country is the human mind. That's the cause of wealth, human wit. So you've got to do education. Second, you've got to make it possible for people to start small businesses. And you can't start a business without credit. If you're poor, you don't have any money to start a business. And you can't make something unless you can buy the materials, etc. So there has to be a way of getting credit without paying 20, 30, and 40%, which is what they charge you on the black market there. I said, that's a sin against the poor. And you've got to find a way of, and third, you've got to find a way of incorporating businesses cheaply and quickly. In Hong Kong, it's 30 days maximum. And you do it in writing, and you pay equivalent of US $30, and that's it. Because states don't create corporations, individuals do. The state has a right to register them in terms of the rule of law. But it's important to be incorporated because if somebody sues you, and they will, they'll try to put a small businessman out of business in Guatemala or anywhere else. They'll be able to take everything away from you, your home even, unless you're incorporated. And they can attack your legal person, but not your real person. It's 3 things is all you have to do. And the best measurement of how well you're doing in a country is how many new small businesses are being started every year. If you keep that on the uptick, things are going to look better. And by the way, I have a Novak rule of how you can tell when this is another way to tell when it's working. By the length of women's skirts. When things are looking grim, the skirts get longer. When they're looking better, the skirts get shorter. And there came a time in Central Europe when there was no more shorter to get. But oddly, it was better for the women than the young men, because for the young men, it was hard to find jobs, and to be able to support a woman in the way she should be supported and a child, it was pretty intimidating. Anyway.
Please join me in thanking Ambassador Michael Novak.
Thanks a lot.